Right, let's get into some charts, guys. Great to be back with you. As usual, I will kick off by reminding you that nothing you see here or on my X feed through at Part-Time Charts constitutes financial advice. All of this is purely for entertainment purposes, a chance for me to share ideas and musings on where we are in the market, but I'm certainly not an investment professional, and the clue should be in the title, part-time trader. I'm someone who has obsessed over charts for quite a few years now and is slowly teaching myself how to be profitable and how to make the right moves at the right time. So hopefully you find some of what I share useful, but certainly don't make any financial decisions off the back of it. And if you do find any of it interesting, entertaining, please smash the like button and hit subscribe to help me grow the channel. Right, let's make a start with this. So this is about as high a time frame as you can go on Bitcoin. This is the price of Bitcoin since inception. Which is, gosh, like 16 years ago now. Time flies when you're having fun with the charts. I put this chart up, right, because a lot has happened in markets the last week, and Bitcoin in particular, and the whole cryptocurrency ecosystem seems to be doing really well. And as we know, people who are involved in crypto tend to get drawn into a lot of what happens on the lower time frame. So much so that people are generally just watching every kind of minute by minute tick on the charts, hoping, obsessing over the investments they've made, and praying that those will go up and appreciate massively and deliver the riches that prior returns have given to some of the early investors in the cryptocurrency space. And I suppose I put this chart up because I really question whether now is the time. If you zoom out, whether now is the time to be really bullish on Bitcoin. And I'm going to flick through a few charts that just help to paint a bit of context as to where we are in the overall market cycle and why I believe that it's foolish to be super bullish up here. Now, many people know that a few weeks ago I became short-term bullish and I made a decent long on Bitcoin, which we can come to later. But my macro position on cryptocurrencies hasn't changed. I think we are on the brink of a major correction, one that will shock most people. And even if you don't buy into that, I suppose it's hard to argue when looking at this chart that the trend over the last 15 years has been one of diminishing returns. So each of these big vertical grey lines represents a halving. And what you can see is that since each halving, we have seen diminishing returns on Bitcoin. And that essentially means that if you measure from the halving to the top of a cycle or a move to the upside, you will notice that those moves have been getting smaller and smaller over time. So if you go all the way back to the very early days where, Bitcoin was something that most of us weren't particularly interested in, and very few of us actually had a position, you can see that back then, you'd get from the first halving in 2012 to the top of the big move in the market that followed over the course of about a year or so, you will see that the market made a 100x gain. Fast forward to 2016 and the halving that preceded the big sort of blow off top in crypto, probably the move that lured a decent chunk of us into the market. I certainly started dabbling with cryptocurrencies in the summer of 2017, sort of halfway up this ride here, and I know lots of people begun to become interested in the market during that move. And again, you've gone from a 100x move in 2012, 2013 to more like a 30x move, but still obviously really significant gains from the halving in 2016 to the cycle top in late 2017, early 2018. And then you fast forward, the next halving comes in 2020, and you see from the point of the halving to the peak of the market, you see something like a 600% move, so a 6x move. And then recently, we haven't even made a 2x move off the back of the halving that took place in April. In fact, prices, at one point was up 70%, but has largely moved sideways in the grand scheme of things since then, right? So we've sort of gone from well, a sideways is probably an understatement, but we've gone from about 60 grand to a peak of 110. We've come back into the 75, 80k region, and now we're flirting with 100k again. So again, just look at the plain maths of it. 104x move, 30x move, 6x move, and then up 70% since the halving so far. So the big question in my mind is there any reason to believe that these diminishing returns are coming to an end? Is this the moment? And clearly at some point this chart has to break, right? So this log regression trend that sees us, paint a clearer picture of these diminishing returns. Either we're going to trade sideways forevermore, and this gets smaller and smaller and narrower over time, this band in which price is bouncing around in, or it's going to break. And the question is it going to break to the upside or to the downside? And I suppose key to my kind of thesis on the market and my position that now is not the time to be bullish on cryptocurrencies is the idea that I think equities are going to perform really poorly over the next 2 years. And if that's the case, then my supposition is that Bitcoin is going to follow suit. So there's a whole bunch of assumptions made there. One is that equities are going to move much lower. Two is that Bitcoin will remain correlated with equities during that time, and that will see the trend of diminishing returns continue. And I suspect, in my mind, what's going to happen is we will at least come back down to test the lower boundary of this log uptrend. But I think at that point it will actually break. And then eventually, in years to come, probably towards the end of this decade or early in the 2030s, I do think the trend will break to the upside too. So lots in there, but for me, I just don't see the case at the moment that market conditions, when I look at equities, are strong enough to suggest that this is the point at which this log trend breaks and we head much higher. And lots of people are calling for several $100,000 over the coming months and years. I just cannot see it. I think it's going to be a long time once the correction takes hold before you see Bitcoin trading at these prices, at least in my view, 4 to 5 years before we get back up here once price begins to roll over. So look, undoubtedly, undeniably, we are seeing diminishing returns in the crypto market. The big question for you is, are you bullish enough to believe that trend is coming to an end now, and that price is no longer going to be capped by this upper boundary of this log chart here? So that's the big question. What other clues can we find? I wanted to visit a few charts. The first I wanted to visit is the Mag 7. So as you know, equities, the bounce that we've seen in equities over the last couple of years, pushing to all-time highs, has particularly been driven by the dominance of the Mag 7. So some of the big tech companies, Apple, Amazon, etc., they have done incredibly well. And you can see that in the chart here. I mean, this unfortunately only dates back to October 23, but you've seen this really seismic move, big move to the upside. But what I'm seeing now is that the macro uptrend has broken, and that some of these key levels are starting to get violated. So the first warning sign for me is a breakdown of an uptrend. The second is that as part of that uptrend break, we have broken back beneath this key support and resistance zone, which, if we were bullish, I just think both of these would have held. We would have seen a bounce, and on a higher time frame, this key level here, which held as support resistance a couple of times before being broken, would have held. Instead, what I think we're seeing is the first major bounce in a prolonged and drawn out bear market. And I'll point to a couple of other charts just to give you a flavor as to why I believe that to be the case. So back in February, as I pointed out on X earlier today, I was one of few people that were calling the top here, and I said that this looked like distribution before a downtrend and a break of this rising channel that we saw here. And I likened the position that we were in here to where we were back in late 21 when the market began to stall here, and we saw obviously a sharp sell-off over the coming year in 2022. And I said that we were about to see the same thing, and we have. But I think this big bounce, so we sold off so quickly here. The market on so many levels became so oversold that buyers have since stepped in. And a few weeks ago, I predicted that we were probably going to come back up and retest the level that we saw here, and that would probably be the moment where we start to roll over. And we have done that. So the first part of that plan has come to fruition. We're back up at these levels here. My expectation is that over the next couple of weeks, price begins to roll over, and that the next drop will be the one that really scares people. Because so far, all we've seen on this bounce is, record numbers of retail investors flooding into the market. There's been huge capital flows into equities. Bears are being mocked now, especially as this bounce has been sustained over, the last 5 or 6 weeks. Everybody has got a short-term memory, and nobody believes that, very few people believe that price could roll over and make new lows from here. But that's exactly what I anticipate happening. And as I've said many times before, if you zoom out, it's really hard to argue that this structure is bullish at the moment. We've seen a break in the long-term uptrend that dates back to early 2023. And again, a bit like the Mag 7 on the previous chart, this key support and resistance level has been violated in my view. And it's possible that we squeeze a bit higher to come back and test it. But eventually, I think this rolls over and makes new lows. And one of the reasons why I'm pretty confident on that view, if you go back and look at some of the previous videos I've made, we are seeing a disinversion of the yield curve, which has been inverted to a scale and to a length of across a length of time that we haven't seen in the entire history of public stock markets. So if you look at, we've spent 2 years with the yield curve being heavily inverted at levels that we haven't seen in my lifetime. That disinversion has begun now, and every time we've seen a similar pattern emerge over the last kind of 40, 50 years, potentially going all the way back to the Great Depression, we have seen a major correction in the stock market. So you can see, I've touched on that in a bit more detail in previous videos. I won't go into it now, but there are some fundamental macro reasons why I think investors should be scared right now, why I'm certainly not positioning for longs. So again, going back, when you accept that we are seeing diminishing returns, a trend of smaller gains made by investors post-halving, when you see that we're now kind of up at the upper boundary of this long-term trend line that has capped price for many, many years, and you combine that with the fact that tech stocks, the Mag 7, the Nasdaq are all potentially about to put in the first major lower high since a break of these trend lines that go all the way back to early 2023. And you combine that with the fact that the yield curve is disinverting, and historically that's been a really strong sign that a correction is coming, then I think for you to be bullish here, you are saying that this time is going to be different, that something is fundamentally different this time. And it might be that your argument is that, this here was the crash, that we saw 26% drawdown from top to bottom on the Nasdaq, and that was enough to satisfy the bears who were calling for recession and economic crash, partly owing to the yield curve inversion that I've talked about. But in my view, this doesn't even touch the sides. I think we are, I've looked at interest rates in previous videos. I've looked at the stress that we see in the bond market. I think there are major financial challenges facing the entire globe at the moment. And, while it's not always smart to be a bear, because, more often than not, the people that are calling for recessions are proven wrong, I do think that technically it's possible to see the wood for the trees if you just focus on price action. And I'm not seeing anything in markets at the moment that tell me that we should be bullish. Now, would that change if we reclaim this level? I'd potentially start to doubt myself a bit more than what I am doing. But there are other ways that we can seek clues from the market about what's coming. And, when you start to dig into some of the individual stocks that make up the Nasdaq, that make up some of these big indexes that we look to for steer on where we are in the market cycle, none of those have cleaner price action than Netflix. And I said last week that I think we were hitting a kind of macro top here, and that price was going to completely crumple and fold into 2026 and 2027 in line with my overall macro thesis. And so again, if you're looking for invalidation at the moment, I am extremely bearish, and I do expect some huge declines, in the region of 90% plus on some of these stocks. And I expect the NASDAQ to be down by about 75% by the time it's all said and done from top to bottom. But where would I be wrong? Well, looking at something like Netflix, I would be wrong if we started to break above and hold on the weekly time frame above this massive trend line that has capped price for years. And there are other stocks, Meta, I've talked about, a similar pattern unfolding. And again, called the top successfully on this back in Feb. Meta has struggled to bounce as hard and as far as some of the other equities that I've talked about in recent weeks, particularly Netflix. And I think this weakness that we're seeing, to me, there's nothing bullish about this chart just yet. Were we to come back up here and break above this line, maybe I'd question my overall position. But for now, I am extremely pessimistic about what is in store for investors in equities. I did say that a lot has happened in markets recently, and one of the things that makes me really excited about what's coming is the price action that we're seeing on USD, and in particular the dollar index, the DXY. To me, this caught me off guard, I won't lie. I mean, look, we seem to have this sort of trend line here capping price, and as we broke out of this range earlier in the year, I called the bottom on the dollar index back in August, September last year. And when we broke out above this downtrend, retested it, I expected this move above this range high to lead to much higher prices on the US dollar relative to other assets, and I expected the dollar index to come into this 114 region at some point in 2025. Obviously we haven't had that, and when we broke back into the range, that was a sure sign for me that things were going pear-shaped for the dollar. Obviously the Trump tariffs and all the kind of macro stuff that we've seen recently have exacerbated the sell-off that we've seen in recent months. But what I find really interesting is that price is now hanging around these lows and refuses to break down further. And I think there's a lot of bearish sentiment out there on the dollar at the moment, just as, in my mind, we should be thinking about the dollar appreciating as people start to potentially flood out of risk on assets if fear starts to grip the markets again. So for me, I'm really interested in, on a weekly time frame, are we going to reclaim these lows, which I think would at least open the door for upside into the 106 region, 105, 106 region. So that's a really exciting development if it happens. Like I say, it would have to happen on the weekly time frame for me to become super bullish on the US dollar. But it's just interesting if you go all the way back to the 2008 crisis and you compare what happened with the dollar. In the early days of the 2008 crisis, you had the dollar rolling over with equities, and then at some point they decoupled, and just before you got this really violent leg down where the market fell off a cliff, the dollar started coming into its own and started trending up in a big way. And I just wonder whether we're going to see something similar here, that in the first leg down for equities, the dollar followed suit and the dollar went lower. But I just wonder whether, and it might not happen overnight, but whether at some point we're going to reclaim this low. And as equities start to move into a much more violent phase of their correction, we could see the dollar appreciate massively. So again, this is just another, I'm trying to piece the market together, and this is another sign that if we start to reclaim this, to me, it's more confluence and gives me more confidence in my view that Bitcoin, crypto, and equities are all heading lower. Right, let's switch gears and start to look at lower time frames on some of these assets that we're talking about. The first one that I wanted to touch on was Bitcoin. As you all know, I've covered this ad nauseum in recent weeks, but back in mid-April, so about a month ago now, as price broke this downtrend, I flipped bullish and said that short term there was some serious upside on the table for Bitcoin. I rode that trade until last weekend, and I've been really open about the fact that I've missed this last leg up. But for me personally, banking a winner was important here, and given, you know, I talked about Netflix coming into high time frame resistance, the fact that we were reaching levels that I expected to mark a top and a bounce for equities and indexes. For all those reasons, I was cautious here, and Bitcoin has obviously pushed up considerably since I exited, so we're up sort of 9 or 10 grand since then. But the move that I caught was significant, and I always say, you know, take profit. It's important. Bank your winners where they exist, because you'll go through periods where they'll be hard to come by. So, you know, capitalizing when you're ahead of the market is always a good thing. So look, where are we? I think this could push up higher. Absolutely. There is reason to believe, I think, that Bitcoin could go as high as 114k and would eventually be capped by this sort of downtrend that I think is really, really key to my overall thesis. So we could see a continued push over the coming days into this region, take out these highs before rolling over. The other scenario that I'm open-minded about is, now that we've taken out all that liquidity at 100k, if we were to get back under, I think that here would be a trigger for me for more downside, and I'd be looking at shorting opportunities. So not much has changed on the lower time frames. I know you know, people like to mock, and they don't really understand the difference between higher time frame and lower time frame analysis. On the higher time frame, I'm still really bearish, guys. Nothing's changed. I do genuinely expect Bitcoin to decline by 90 to 95% as fear grips traditional markets. I see no reason to believe that Bitcoin is decoupling from equities over a high enough time frame. You know, all the evidence, if you look back at 2020, 2022, all the evidence shows that when major corrections happen in the stock market, Bitcoin will not be immune. So I don't see that changing in the short term. And given my view on equities, I think this is going to roll over at some point in the near future. Another clue that we can look at is, I've been flagging this one for quite a while. This stables dominance chart. So this is USDT dominance plus USDC dominance, the two major stable coins in the space. Now, I made no secret of the fact that this is partly why I got out of my Bitcoin longs at the weekend, because I could see I could see the level that stables dominance was at. We were resting on this support, and I thought that there was a decent likelihood that, you know, price would start to push off. Instead, what we've seen is a breakdown, and if this breakdown lasts, then we could come back into these lows, and that could give Bitcoin and altcoins the fuel for more upside. But I'd just be careful. You know, sometimes these trend lines, they're set up to trick us and to trap us. You know, there are a few examples just in this chart alone. I mean, look at this one here, where you had this trend line supporting price. We broke down. At that point, that was the point to be bullish on Bitcoin and crypto and bearish on stables dominance. But you did, just before it properly went into a downtrend, you did get this one move back up above the trend line, and it's tempting to think that's a reclaim. And I wonder whether we're seeing something similar here, where we've broken down, but maybe at some point over the coming weeks we reclaim this and start to head higher, which would obviously put pressure on Bitcoin and alt. So no definitive conclusions for me at the moment. I certainly don't want to be in short positions in the crypto market while Bitcoin is doing its thing. And equally, we've seen some really strong price action from ETH over the last week. So Ethereum has, you know, I've said for some time that the dream short scenario for me on Ethereum would be, I think this level is so clean here that a reclaim of it would make a lot of people bullish. And if we were to reclaim it and then break down, that would be, for me, the trigger for a big swing short. And today we've tested this downtrend again. We have reclaimed over the last couple of days that 2150 level that I said was going to be so key. But if we start to see weakness and price gets back underneath, like it might do in either of these scenarios, then I think that is a really bearish sign, and that bulls are going to be caught offside in a big way. You can already see that it's not the most convincing break of this downtrend. And if we start to see weakness into early next week and price is back underneath that 2150 level, I think that's a warning sign for bulls. It's possible that we continue to kind of float above here for a little while. We may even pull back before coming back up to break this in a more convincing manner. But eventually, I expect price to roll over and to make new lows. And I think the next move takes us down into the $1,000 region when it eventually happens. And I know there are lots of people. This is a pattern that I keep seeing a lot on X, and I think Crypto Wolf is the one that is going big on this at the moment. And look, he's made some good calls over the years. I've been a follower of Crypto Wolf for a long time, but he has been offside with Ethereum for a long time. Ethereum has not gone anywhere relative to Bitcoin. It's only declined relative to Bitcoin. So he's been in the wrong asset for a long time. And B, people have been bullish on Ethereum USD the entire time that we've been correcting. So all the way from back in December down to here, people were redrawing trend lines, finding any sort of narrative they could to be bullish. And for me, is it possible? I think the argument is that this is some sort of right-angled triangle, and that price is going to do something like this and just blast off into the stratosphere over the coming months. And I just can't see that. I just don't think market conditions will allow it. People haven't got any money. The money that they do have, they've piled into the stock market, and they're likely to be facing a massive drawdown. I find it hard to believe that we're going to see the kind of price action that some people are calling for. So it's a possibility, never rule it out. And if we start on the weekly, if we start holding for multiple weeks, this 2150 area that I've mentioned here, then possibly at that point, I will start to reconsider, especially if we start to get some more upside on these equities that are starting to show weakness on the higher time frame. So I'll be open-minded, but at the moment, my base case is that we're going to head much lower, that this is a failed reclaim in hindsight, that it's a trap that leaves a lot of people feeling bullish, and that the next move down is going to be a really violent one. What else have I got for you? Look, a couple of charts just to wrap up. One, I've posted this a few times, but maybe haven't come back to it for quite a few months. This is the Grayscale Bitcoin Trust, so one of the early ETF offerings in the crypto space from Grayscale. And I like this chart because there's some really clean price action here relative to the traditional Bitcoin USD chart. And you can see here, in my view, this is nothing more than a macro rising wedge where price is coming back in to test this trend line that is capping the upside on GBTC. And I believe at some stage that we're going to see price roll over in a big way and come all the way back. I'm expecting a decline in the region of about 95%, 96% over the next couple of years. So is it possible that I'm totally wrong? Absolutely. But at the moment, from a technical standpoint, unless we start breaking above this downtrend and holding on the weekly and the monthly, I see absolutely no reason to believe this is anything other than a bounce. And look at what happened with Bitcoin. You go back in 2021, I remember as price suffered this big collapse, 50% drawdown in the spring of 2021. We then came back up into the region of the previous highs, Everybody was super bullish, and I think we're seeing something here now. We've had this multi-month correction coming back into the highs, and just as everybody is complacent again and no longer feels worried about Bitcoin and crypto and the markets more generally, I think that's the very point at which we roll over and start to see big declines. So again, from a technical standpoint, if you're looking for invalidation, if you're a bear and you're worried about missing upside, try to contain your FOMO, your emotions, and just remember, if you zoom out, we haven't made new highs yet. We certainly haven't broken the downtrend on either Bitcoin USD or on the price of GBTC. And then just a little pet chart just to end with. Last weekend, I posted this, which is a really clean chart for Lido, which again is another pointless shitcoin that exists on the Ethereum chain. But interesting gauge for me as to where the market is heading overall. And I'm still not seeing the kind of strength in alts versus Bitcoin that would lead me to believe that we're on the brink of an alt season. I said back here late last week that the dream short would be that we come in to test these highs here, we grab a lot of liquidity, force a lot of people out of short positions, and then move back down under this really clean SR level. That in doing that, price daily closes on price beneath this level would then give me increased confidence that a swing short was in play. So these are the kind of moves I'm looking for. And again, just another example of why the market can be quite tricky, because we were very cleanly holding beneath these lows last week. In fact, for the last 2 or 3 weeks. And at that point, it would have been really tempting to go short. But I did say that I could imagine, just to mess with everybody's heads and wallets, I could imagine price pushing back up one more time before rolling over. So it's something I'm looking out for. But again, bigger picture, guys, unless we see this downtrend break in a meaningful way on the weekly or monthly time frame, unless we see breakouts on the higher time frames on things like GBTC, I think this is nothing more than a short-term bounce. People are getting very, very excited, but I expect that price on crypto is going to roll over and follow what I expect to happen on equities, which is a pretty big collapse into the summer months. So let's see where we are. It's possible that we push a teeny bit higher in the short term. It's equally possible that we go sideways for a few months, but I'm certainly not seeing any reason to be macro bullish here. Nothing has changed for me, and I know people keep challenging me. Look, I know how to flip bias, guys. I've been bearish for a long time, but a few weeks ago when I saw Bitcoin breaking out, I went long, and I told everybody I was going long. So I'm not afraid to flip bias, but on a higher time frame, there is no reason for me to flip bias at the moment, because we're not seeing the kind of strength that would warrant that. So for me, still comfortably sat in my bearish thesis, waiting for major opportunities in the market in 2027, and at the same time thinking about how I play commodities to build my capital so that I'm ready when the bottom does arrive in crypto. And I think that bottom is a long, long, long way down from here. Sorry to say that again. If you're bullish, I know it will hurt, and you might be tempted to think I'm a complete idiot, but so far nothing that has happened in the market has proven me wrong on the higher time frame. We have come down and price has suffered exactly as I said it would back in Feb. And yes, we've bounced, and I predicted a bounce, but now is not the time to be bullish in my book. So look, that's it for this week. Great to spend a bit of time with you as usual. Hope you've enjoyed this. Hope some of it has been useful. Even if you disagree, it's useful food for thought potentially, and maybe just gives you a different perspective on the market. But have a great weekend, and I look forward to coming back with some more content next week.